Usually, when we talk about empires, we tend to picture something incredibly clean and absolute.
Right, like a solid block on a map.
Exactly. We picture this map, and we picture that map turning one solid, bold color. It's, territorial monopoly.
Yeah.
The army marches in, the flag is planted, and suddenly the whole territory operates under a single unified chain of command. But
And
then,
you step into the world of medieval Europe.
right, you look at the Holy Roman Empire, and suddenly that beautiful, simple map just shatters. It shatters into 1,000 different jagged, overlapping pieces.
It really does. It's a mess.
We are looking at a political landscape that literally defies the very definition of centralized power. Yet somehow, this supposedly chaotic system lasted for nearly 1,000 years.
Yeah, and it forces us to completely reevaluate our baseline assumptions about power. I mean, we are so conditioned to view history through the lens of the modern nation state.
Where power is, highly visible and centralized. Exactly, where it's monopolized. You're either the sovereign or you're a subject. But the Holy Roman Empire survived by actively subverting that binary.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. It survived through institutionalized fragmentation. It operated without a single unified army, without a centralized bureaucracy, and without a single unified legal system for the vast majority of its existence.
Which brings us to the absolutely fascinating source material we are unpacking today. And welcome to you, our resident learner, to another deep dive.
We've got a really unique set of notes today.
We do. We aren't just looking at, a chronological list of medieval kings or the standard military history of Central Europe.
Right.
We actually have a set of analytical notes that map the entire history and function of the Holy Roman Empire onto a psychological, sort of systemic subpersonality profile named Kenny.
Which is such a brilliant framing device.
It is. The author of these notes uses this Kenny persona to decode the empire, not as a traditional conquest state, but as a masterpiece of modular system design. Yeah, and the goal of this deep dive is to figure out the exact mechanics of how survival through fragmentation actually works.
What happens when a decentralized system is stressed to its absolute limit?
Exactly. And what this medieval organism teaches you about navigating overlapping chaotic systems today.
Okay, let's unpack this.
No.
Because treating a medieval empire like a modern systems engineering problem is just too good.
It really changes the whole perspective. The Kenny framing device is incredibly effective because it forces us to look past the individual egos of the men wearing the crown.
Right, we're looking at the underlying operating system of the civilization itself.
Exactly. So the notes describe the Kenny persona as deeply logical, systems-oriented, structured, and obsessed with long-term integrity over, flashy spectacle.
But to understand how that systemic personality functioned, we have to start with the physical board this game was played on.
Yes, the geography. We had to look at the geographical mechanics of Central Europe.
Right, because at its height, this territory encompassed modern-day Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Czech lands, the Low Countries, and stretched all the way down into northern Italy.
And that geography presents an immediate, massive contradiction.
It really does. On one hand, you have the absolute lifeblood of the medieval economy, which are the major river system.
The Rhine, the Danube, the Elbe.
Yeah, these are the commercial superhighways connecting the Baltic trade networks down toward the Mediterranean. Add to that the agricultural capacity of the northern plains and the immense mineral wealth of the southern uplands.
It creates an engine of incredible prosperity.
Right. So my immediate thought is, this is the perfect geographic cradle for an absolute superpower. If you control the Rhine, you control the wealth of the continent.
You'd think so, right? That would be the case if the terrain allowed for the rapid projection of force.
Ah, right. The mountains.
Yeah, those same river valleys are fractured by massive logistical walls. You've got the Alps in the south as the obvious barrier, but you also have the dense ancient forests of Germania.
Like the Black Forest.
Exactly, the Black Forest, the Harz Mountains. In a medieval context, trying to project centralized military power across that topography is a logistical nightmare.
Because travel was just so painfully slow.
Right. If an emperor sitting in Vienna or Prague wants to assert direct control over, say, a rebellious bishop in Cologne, he cannot simply march a standing army across the map in a week.
It's not like hopping on a highway.
No. Moving thousands of men, horses, and siege equipment through muddy, forested, mountainous terrain takes months, and it drains the imperial treasury at a catastrophic rate.
Wait, I look at that wealth, though, and I wonder, why didn't an emperor just impose a crushing centralized tax on the river trade?
Like a toll.
Yeah, to fund a permanent, mobile army. If you have independent trading hubs getting rich along the Rhine, you build a few massive fortresses, choke the river, extract the wealth, and force a monopoly.
Like a modern tech monopoly buying up local competitors.
Exactly. You essentially strangle the local autonomy using their own commercial success.
Well, the structural flaw in that approach is the concept of the Zollberg, the toll castles that literally dotted the Rhine.
Oh, right.
The emperor didn't own them. The local dukes, counts, and archbishops did.
Wow, okay.
The wealth stayed in the valleys precisely because the local nodes of power were deeply entrenched. If the emperor tried to unilaterally seize that revenue stream, he wouldn't just be fighting one local duke.
He'd trigger a systemic rebellion.
Exactly. The
Okay.
logistical cost of suppressing a dozen highly fortified, incredibly wealthy local strongholds simultaneously was impossible to meet.
So the environment itself vetoed centralization.
It did. It's much more like an old-growth forest. There is no single massive trunk you can protect to save the whole forest.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. The vitality is entirely distributed throughout the root system and the thousands of individual trees.
That ecological metaphor makes a ton of sense. The geography forced a compromise where the center had to accept the autonomy of the periphery.
Yes, the empire couldn't survive by trying to force all these disparate territories into a single mold.
Especially with their different languages and customary laws and economies.
Exactly. It had to embrace the diversity and find a way to hold them together under a shared overarching framework.
Which brings us directly back to the 4 specific traits of the Kenny persona that the notes map onto the Holy Roman Empire.
The first trait being structure and fragmentation.
Right. And this isn't about designing a perfect frictionless system in a vacuum. It's about engineering stability out of inherent chaos.
It's coordination rather than control. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire was an unbelievable maze of overlapping jurisdictions.
It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
Oh, it was. You had secular prince-electors, ecclesiastical archbishops who ruled vast territories, free imperial cities that answered only to the emperor.
And don't forget the minor imperial knights.
Right, guys who held a single castle but literally claimed sovereignty.
Wow.
So the Kenny trait here is the bureaucratic endurance required to keep those hundreds of autonomous nodes communicating and adhering to a broad set of rules.
Usually through the mechanism of the imperial diet, right? The Reichstag.
Exactly, the Reichstag.
And to enforce those rules without a standing army, we get to the second Kenny trait, legitimacy through principle.
Because if the emperor cannot physically compel obedience, the entire system rests on the shared belief that his authority is legally and morally valid.
Which totally explains the absolute obsession in the medieval period with rightful rule, ancient charters, and legal precedent.
Right. If a dispute breaks out between the Duke of Bavaria and the Archbishop of Salzburg over, say, a silver mine,
The emperor's ability to mediate depends entirely on both parties accepting his role as the supreme principled arbiter.
exactly. The moment the emperor is perceived as acting purely out of tyrannical self-interest rather than upholding the overarching legal principle, his authority just evaporates.
Which leads into the third trait, maintenance over spectacle. And the notes illustrate this with an incredibly evocative analogy.
Oh, the dishwasher, I love this one.
Me too.
Yeah.
The dishwasher is the silent anchor of the house. I found this to be just the most profound insight in the entire source text.
It really is.
Because, we naturally gravitate toward historical figures who build monuments, conquer continents, hold massive triumphs.
The fleshy stuff.
Yeah, but the dishwasher demands no applause.
Yeah.
You never invite guests over to admire your dishwasher running its cycle.
No, you definitely don't.
Yet, the moment it breaks, the underlying hygiene of the entire house collapses. Dishes pile up, the inhabitants start fighting over basic chores, and the structural piece of the environment just vanishes.
And the emperor's role was literally to be the imperial dishwasher for Central Europe.
Exactly.
His function was alignment and maintenance. He was constantly traveling, holding court, issuing charters, resolving petty inheritance disputes.
Just confirming the ancient privileges of the towns over and over.
It is a grueling, unglamorous administrative slog. The notes describe the empire as a blueprint on a war table.
Covered in coffee stains, people constantly arguing over the exact measurements?
Right, and parts of it are heavily revised. But the blueprint itself is designed for endurance. It takes the hits and keeps the core structure intact.
Which feeds right into the final Kenny trait, Civilizational scaffolding.
Right, because the aspiration wasn't just to enrich the ruling dynasty, though they certainly tried to do that.
Obviously.
The systemic goal was to provide a protective legal canopy for Christian civilization. It was an attempt to build a framework that outlived individual human egos.
But, acting as the chief maintenance officer for an entire civilization creates a uniquely stressful vulnerability.
It definitely does.
The emperor is sitting at this war table trying to maintain the scaffolding, but he fundamentally lacked a monopoly on authority. He wasn't the only one claiming to be the ultimate boss of this system.
No, he wasn't. Which plunges us into the layered, highly unstable architecture of medieval power. Authority in the Holy Roman Empire was profoundly negotiated.
Shared not just among the emperor and the territorial princes, but critically with the papacy.
The ultimate tension that defined the empire for centuries was the structural conflict between the imperium and the sacerdotium.
Imperial authority and papal authority.
Exactly. The emperor viewed himself as the secular leader of a sacred political order, right? The sword that protected Christendom.
But the pope claimed absolute supremacy in spiritual matters, wielding the second sword, so to speak.
Right. And the distinction between spiritual and secular matters in the 11th century is virtually non-existent.
That's a huge point. Religion wasn't just like a private Sunday activity. It was the entire organizing force of reality.
It dictated the legal code, legitimized the social hierarchy, controlled education.
It literally structured time through the liturgical calendar.
Yeah. So when the papacy claims supremacy in spiritual matters, it is functionally claiming the right to dictate the moral boundaries of the emperor's political actions.
And this systemic friction violently ignites during the investiture controversy in late 11th and early 12th centuries.
Right. On a superficial level, this conflict looks like a bureaucratic turf war over who gets to invest or appoint local bishops.
Like, does the emperor hand the new bishop his ring and staff, or does the pope?
Exactly.
I read the details of this, and the stakes are staggering because of what a bishop actually functioned as in the Holy Roman Empire.
They weren't just humble priests giving sermons.
No. A bishop in this system, a prince-bishop, was a massive landholder. They collected imperial taxes, raised local militias, governed large cities.
And they acted as the literate civil service for the emperor.
Right. And since bishops couldn't marry and have legitimate heirs, the emperor used them to bypass the hereditary nobility.
It was a brilliant hack, really. When a bishop died, the land reverted back to the emperor, who could then appoint a new loyalist.
So the imperial church system, the Reichswehr, was the very administrative spine of the emperor's power.
Precisely. If the pope successfully claims the exclusive right to appoint these bishops, he essentially strips the emperor of his entire civil service.
And his primary mechanism for controlling territory.
Yeah, it is a battle over who possesses the ultimate organizing authority of Christian society. Two completely legitimate, fundamentally incompatible frameworks of power crashing into each other.
I sort of conceptualize this as a catastrophic failure in corporate governance.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Imagine a massively successful startup. You have the emperor acting as the chief operating officer. He controls the physical servers. He secures the bank accounts. He signs the treaties, manages the day-to-day logistics.
He keeps the lights on.
Right. Then you have the Pope, who acts as the visionary founder and chairman of the board. He wrote the original mission statement. He holds the absolute moral loyalty of the user base, and he controls the brand identity.
Okay, yeah.
So the COO needs to hire a new regional vice president, the bishop, to manage a highly profitable territory. The COO selects a logistical expert loyal to him.
But the chairman intervenes.
Exactly. The chairman says, no, this hire violates our core ethical charter. I'm voiding the contract and appointing my own candidate. When those two overlapping authorities collide, the entire company freezes.
Who does the regional staff obey? The guy with the physical assets, or the guy who dictates their moral salvation?
It's a total crash.
And the mechanism of that paralysis was excommunication. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII issued the Dictatus Papae, a document that explicitly claimed the Pope had the power to depose emperors.
That is a massive flex.
Huge. When Emperor Henry IV defied him over the appointment of the Archbishop of Milan, Gregory didn't just write a strongly worded letter. He excommunicated Henry.
Wow.
He declared the emperor to be outside the body of Christ.
Which fundamentally dissolves the political glue of the empire. Gregory essentially broadcast to all the restless German dukes, your oaths of fealty to this man are null and void. You have a moral mandate to rebel.
And they immediately do. The Swabian dukes rise up. and Henry's entire political infrastructure begins to disintegrate.
So to stop the systemic collapse, we get one of the most vivid illustrations of the limits of secular power in European history.
The walk to Canossa.
Yeah. In the winter of 1077, Henry V crosses the Alps to intercept the Pope at the castle of Canossa. The most powerful secular ruler in Europe is forced to stand barefoot in the snow outside the castle gates,
Wearing a hair shirt, fasting for 3 consecutive days.
just begging the Pope for absolution. It is an unparalleled visceral humiliation.
It really is.
And it perfectly exposes the shadow side of the Kenny persona. Kenny craves a logical, ordered system with clear jurisdictions. But Canossa proves that in a dual authority system, conflict isn't just an accident.
No, it's a structural guarantee. You cannot have 2 supreme universal authorities without them eventually trying to dismantle each other.
Just to achieve some systemic clarity.
Exactly. And yet, despite this catastrophic clash, the system didn't permanently break.
Right, because Henry V eventually gets his absolution, goes back to Germany, crushes the rebellion, and years later actually marches on Rome to drive Gregory VII into exile.
It's a wild pendulum swing. But to understand how the empire survived these massive structural stress tests, we have to look at the specific individuals who actively tried to build, break, and fix the machine over the centuries.
We have to look at their function within the architecture, rather than just calling them heroes or villains.
Right. Let's start with the foundational architect, Otto first, known as Otto the Great. He's the classic Kenny builder operating in pure execution mode.
He's crowned emperor in 962, and his primary function is laying the concrete for the system.
Otto, I recognize that the Carolingian model of his predecessors had fractured. He needed a new mechanism for stability. First, he secured the physical borders by inflicting a decisive, crushing defeat on the Magyars at the Battle of Lexfeld in 955.
And that singular military victory provided him with the undisputed prestige necessary to enforce domestic alignment.
Right. He buys himself the political capital to build the Reichskirche, the imperial church system we just discussed.
He fuses the German kingship with the Roman imperial legacy and wraps it all up in the administrative capability of the bishops.
He builds the machine. But a century later, the machine meets its ultimate stress tester in Pope Gregory VII.
The challenger.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Gregory VII functions as the ideological challenger. His role in the system was to relentlessly test its moral legitimacy. By asserting that the spiritual sword was superior to the secular sword, he reframed authority entirely.
Which, if you prioritize moral accountability and the independence of the church, Gregory is a visionary reformer.
But if you prioritize political stability and avoiding civil war, Gregory is an absolute menace.
Through the Kenny lens, he is the principal first archetype, willing to literally burn down the immediate political reality to enforce the overarching moral structure.
In Henry IV, the man shivering in the snow functions as the defender. It's easy to look at Canossa and see him as weak, but his structural role was to expose the limits of both sides.
He takes the hit, absorbs the papal strike, but then fights back to ensure the secular authority isn't completely subjugated.
There is no clean, elegant resolution for Henry. His entire reign is a brutal, grinding series of trade-offs just to keep the imperial dishwasher running.
But as we move forward a century, we encounter an emperor who decides he is just tired of trade-offs. Frederick Barbarossa, the centralizer.
Oh, Barbarossa. He looked at the institutionalized fragmentation, particularly the incredible booming wealth of the independent city-states in northern Italy, and decided the system needed an upgrade.
He wanted to extract the regalia, right? The royal rights to tolls, coinage, and judicial fines directly from these cities.
Yes. At the Diet of Roncaglia in 1158, he essentially attempts to rewrite the constitutional reality of the empire, demanding that the Italian communes submit to direct imperial administration.
He tries to force the monopoly. He sees these wealthy, autonomous nodes and decides to override their local permissions.
But the system violently rejects the upgrade. The cities realize that their individual wealth makes them targets, so they organize.
They form the Lombard League.
It's exactly, pooling their resources. And in 1176, at the Battle of Legnano, an army composed entirely of citizen militias, merchants, and local infantry manages to defeat Barbarossa's elite imperial knights on the battlefield.
Which is incredible.
Yeah.
Legnano is a profound systemic data point. It proves that local, negotiated, commercial power, when organized, can physically repel a top-down, centralized military mandate.
It really was a shock to the system. Barbarossa's attempted centralization ultimately proved that the empire's structure was inherently decentralized. He was forced to sign the Peace of Constance.
which essentially recognized the autonomy of the communes in exchange for a nominal pledge of allegiance.
Right. Now, I want to contrast Barbarossa's heavy-handed centralization with his grandson, Frederick II, who the notes label the innovator.
Historically known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world,
Yes.
I look at Frederick II spending almost his entire reign in his cosmopolitan court in Sicily, conducting diplomacy with the Sultan of Egypt, writing brilliant scientific treatises on falconry, and I struggle to see him as a diligent system manager.
He doesn't fit the typical mold.
He seemingly abandons the core German territories. To fund his constant wars against the papacy in Italy, he issues the Statutum in Favorum Principum in 1232.
Which was a massive concession.
He literally signs away core imperial rights, the right to mint coins, build castles, establish markets, handing them over to the local German princes.
How is this not a catastrophic dereliction of the Kenny persona? He is trading away the scaffolding of the empire for short-term cash.
It is a brilliant question, and it highlights the real risk of the innovator archetype. Frederick II was a high-level systems thinker who operated on a global scale.
Right?
He successfully negotiated the return of Jerusalem during the Sixth Crusade without shedding a drop of blood, utilizing pure diplomatic leverage.
Which is amazing.
But you are entirely correct about his impact on the German core. By issuing the Statutum, he legally transformed the territorial princes from imperial administrators into semi-sovereign rulers.
He traded structural centralization for immediate pacification. Exactly. He let the German engine run entirely on autopilot, devolving power so thoroughly that the emperor would never again wield direct unilateral control over the German heartland.
Wow.
He expanded the intellectual and diplomatic possibilities of the empire, but he permanently decentralized its legal architecture.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the figure who I found to be the most counterintuitive genius in the entire narrative, Charles IV.
Ah, the stabilizer.
Yes. When I first read about Charles IV and the Golden Bull of 1356, my immediate reaction was, I am reading a surrender document.
It really does look like that at first glance.
Charles looks at this messy, hopelessly fragmented empire where the princes now hold all the cards thanks to Frederick II, and instead of fighting to reclaim imperial power, he just accepts it.
He does.
The Golden Bull formalizes the rules for how the emperor is elected, explicitly naming the 7 prince-electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the king of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg.
And he grants them near total sovereignty within their own lands.
Including the rights to coin money and exercise supreme jurisdiction. Isn't he just codifying his own weakness?
Well, to a mind conditioned to equate power with centralization, the Golden Bull looks like capitulation. But through the systemic lens of the Kenny persona, Charles IV is arguably the greatest architect the empire ever had.
Wait, really?
The greatest? Yes. Charles recognized that fighting the fragmentation was literally destroying the civilization. Civil wars over disputed successions were bleeding the realm dry. So he stopped trying to build a centralized state and instead perfected the decentralized network.
Oh, wow. He looks at the messy blueprint and realizes the mess is the structure.
Exactly. He institutionalized the fragmentation. By explicitly defining the 7 electors and their absolute rights, he removed the ambiguity that caused the wars.
And he also quietly removed the requirement for the Pope to confirm the election, right?
He did, severing a major vector of external interference. He engineered stability out of constraints. The Golden Bull created a constitutional framework that allowed these deeply independent nodes to coexist without needing to destroy each other to feel secure.
So he codified the reality of the ground.
And by doing so, he guaranteed the empire's survival for another 4.5 centuries.
That is the ultimate expression of the dishwasher mindset. Don't fight the mechanics of the machine. Lubricate the gears you actually have.
Beautifully put.
So we spent a lot of time analyzing this from the macro level, looking at the high-stakes architectural design of emperors and popes. But to truly understand the resilience of this system, we have to examine what it was actually doing for the people living inside it.
We have to bring it down to the dirt.
Yes, let's talk about daily life and the psychological architecture of the stacked identity.
Right, because if you zoom in on the Holy Roman Empire from the perspective of a peasant or a guild artisan, the grand political struggles over investiture or electoral rights are entirely invisible.
They just don't matter day to day.
No. Life was intensely, profoundly local. It operated on the principle of subsidiarity, the idea that issues should be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized, competent authority.
Society was rigidly hierarchical, right?
Right.
Divided into those who fought, like the nobility, those who prayed, the clergy, and those who worked, which is the vast majority of the peasantry and the growing urban classes.
Exactly. But within that strict hierarchy, there was a deep reliance on mutual obligation. The peasant owed labor and taxes to the local lord. The lord owed physical protection and justice to the peasant.
And while it was formally a highly patriarchal society, functionally, the economic reality demanded immense contributions from women.
Absolutely. A peasant manor could not physically survive without women managing the agricultural processing, textile production, and livestock.
And in the rapidly expanding urban centers, women were heavily involved in the commercial economy.
Yeah. In cities like Cologne, there were even female-dominated guilds like the silk makers who wielded significant economic leverage.
And even among the nobility, when lords were away on campaigns or at the diet, noble women acted as the primary administrators of vast estates.
Exercising direct legal and economic power.
But what struck me most deeply about this ground-level perspective is the concept of stacked identities. The notes argue that a medieval person didn't wake up in the morning, look out at the fields, and feel a surge of patriotism for the Holy Roman Empire.
No. The concept of imperial citizenship was an entirely abstract canopy hovering miles above their heads. Their identity was built from the soil upward.
Like layers.
Exactly. First and foremost, you were a member of your specific village or urban parish. That was your total universe of immediate survival.
Second, you were the subject of a local lord, or the citizen of a specific free city.
Third, you were part of a regional linguistic or cultural grouping. You were a Swabian, a Bavarian, or a Saxon.
And encompassing all of that, the ultimate unshakable roof over your reality, you were a Christian.
Right.
I look at that psychological architecture, and it strikes me as simultaneously incredibly comforting and utterly terrifying.
How so?
Well, on one hand, you are completely spared the modern existential crisis. You don't have to spend your 20s finding yourself.
That's true.
Your village, your guild, and the church tell you exactly what your purpose is, what your social rank is, and what happens to your soul when you die. The psychological floor is absolute solid rock.
But on the other hand,
But at the same time, your physical survival is incredibly precarious. If it rains too much in your specific valley and the harvest fails, you starve. Total psychological certainty paired with total physical vulnerability.
and from a systems perspective, that stacked identity is the secret to the empire's immense resilience. Think about the mechanics of a modern centralized nation-state.
Okay.
A nation-state requires the top of the stack to be the primary identity. It needs you to identify as French or American first and foremost, so that you will willingly pay national taxes to a distant capital and die in a uniform for a national idea.
Right. But the Holy Roman Empire demanded none of that.
None.
It didn't require active daily patriotism to function.
Not at all. The system survived purely on the strength of the local nodes. As long as the village functioned, the guild produced goods, the lord collected his local dues, and the region remained vaguely aligned with the overarching legal framework, the whole structure endured.
So if a plague wipes out one valley, or a rogue knight rebels in Swabia, the entire canopy doesn't collapse?
Exactly. The damage is compartmentalized. It is the ultimate modular survival strategy.
But those local nodes weren't stagnant. Over the centuries, the villages grew into towns, the towns formed networks, and the economy underwent a massive, explosive shift.
Which brings us to the paradox of wealth, and how the economic boom of the Middle Ages created an administrative nightmare for our imperial dishwasher.
Let's talk about that, because the economic engine of the Holy Roman Empire shifted from local subsistence-level agriculture to a highly dynamic, interconnected commercial network.
Yes. You see the rise of the Hanseatic League in the north, a massive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns led by cities like Lübeck that dominated maritime trade in the Baltic and North Seas.
And they had their own laws, their own navies, and they even negotiated treaties with foreign kings.
They were practically a state within a state. And in the south, cities like Augsburg and Nuremberg became powerhouses of finance and precision manufacturing.
Add to that the explosive growth of the silver mining industry in places like Joachimsthal, which pumped immense liquidity into the local economies.
And the infrastructure supporting this wasn't built by a central imperial department of public works. It was cumulative, open-source development.
Monasteries innovated agricultural tech like the heavy plow and water mills.
Local guilds funded the construction of massive, awe-inspiring Gothic cathedrals to project their own civic prestige.
And this generates the central paradox of the empire's development. As the civilization grew exponentially richer, the centralized state grew relatively weaker.
Exactly. The prosperity actively undermined the emperor's ability to consolidate power.
Which is so weird because in almost any other historical context, economic growth strengthens the central government. When trade booms, the king taxes the trade, uses the revenue to build a massive professional army, and uses that army to break the independence of the nobility.
Right.
So why didn't the emperors simply leverage the wealth of the Hanseatic League or the silver mines of Bohemia to build an unstoppable imperial military machine?
Because of the constitutional reality established by Charles IV and the long history of negotiated power, the emperor simply did not possess the structural mechanism to unilaterally tax the realm.
He couldn't just pass a law.
No, if the emperor needed money for a campaign against the Ottoman Empire, he couldn't just decree a 10% income tax. He had to summon the Reichstag, the imperial diet.
Let's break down the mechanics of the Diet because it highlights exactly why the system was so incredibly slow. It wasn't a modern parliament where a majority vote instantly creates a binding national law.
Not at all. The diet was divided into three colleges: the electors, the princes, both secular and ecclesiastical, and the free imperial cities. When the emperor made a request, the colleges debated it separately. Furthermore, the delegates often operated ad referendum, meaning they didn't have the authority to make a final decision on the spot.
They had to ask permission?
Yes. They had to send messengers riding back to their home territories to ask their local lords or city councils for instructions.
Which means a single request for taxation could take months or even years to negotiate.
Exactly. And the fundamental problem was incentive. Why would a wealthy, autonomous city like Nuremberg, which has its own massive walls and its own hired mercenary army, willingly vote to hand over its silver to an emperor?
Who might turn around and use that exact army to strip Nuremberg of its independence.
Right. They wouldn't. The richer the local nobles became, the more heavily they fortified themselves, and the less they relied on the emperor for protection. Economic growth directly fueled political fragmentation.
Which creates a truly bizarre dynamic when this incredibly wealthy, highly fragmented entity has to interact with the rest of the world. Let's shift our perspective to the world stage.
Okay, yes. Let's examine how the Holy Roman Empire managed its foreign policy, relying on conditional allies and the asymmetry of diplomacy.
Sitting in the geographic heart of Europe, the empire was surrounded by evolving political entities. But to truly grasp how structurally unique the empire was, we have to contrast its diplomatic machinery with its greatest rival to the west, the Kingdom of France.
A perfect contrast. Over the centuries, France is moving on an entirely different trajectory.
The French monarchs are actively breaking the independence of their nobles, centralizing the bureaucracy in Paris, and creating an absolutist state.
Right. The King of France speaks for France. He can mobilize a unified national army, dictate national foreign policy, and negotiate treaties with a single authoritative voice.
So when a French ambassador sits down at the negotiating table, he brings the focused, consolidated power of an entire nation.
But when the Holy Roman Emperor attempts to negotiate, he brings a coalition of highly conditional allies.
Wow, yeah.
The empire had no permanent foreign policy. It had shifting alliances based on internal leverage.
So if the emperor wanted to go to war with France, he had to convince the Diet that the war was in their specific local interests.
Exactly. If the Duke of Burgundy felt that a war with France would hurt his textile trade, he simply wouldn't send troops.
The diplomatic asymmetry was profound. A centralized, fast-moving, absolute monarch negotiating with a slow, cautious, highly fractured committee.
And you see this constantly playing out in how the emperors utilized external conflicts to solve internal problems.
The Crusades are the perfect example of this. When an emperor like Barbarossa or Frederick II takes up the cross and marches toward the Holy Land, it isn't just an act of religious piety.
No, it is a calculated structural maneuver. It is a domestic legitimacy tool.
By leading a crusade, the emperor bypasses the political squabbles of the Diet and taps directly into the overarching religious canopy that unites the civilization.
He activates his role as the sword of Christendom. As we mentioned earlier, when Frederick II successfully negotiates the return of Jerusalem, he acquires immense prestige.
And that prestige makes it significantly harder for the Pope to effectively undermine him back in Europe.
Right. And it forces the German princes to respect his authority on a moral level, even if they resist him on a legal level.
So the empire survived external threats not through rapid dominance, but through a brilliant, exhausting game of geopolitical judo, using the weight of external religious obligations to stabilize the internal political structure.
Exactly. And for hundreds of years, this deeply negotiated, agonizingly slow, open-source system worked.
It absorbed Magyar invasions, papal excommunications, the defiance of wealthy Italian communes, and the sheer logistical impossibility of its own geography.
But a system built on maintaining equilibrium cannot survive when the fundamental environment experiences a rapid, permanent phase shift.
Which brings us to the final act, the slow erosion, and how the empire's greatest evolutionary strengths ultimately became its fatal vulnerabilities.
The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire was not a sudden collapse. It did not fall to a single barbarian invasion the way Rome did.
It eroded from within.
Yes, fundamentally unable to adapt to three massive systemic shocks that altered the underlying physics of European power.
Let's walk through those.
The first was the slow terminal hollow out of the center due to the very decentralization that had previously saved it.
Right. The Golden Bull of 1356 institutionalized the fragmentation to prevent civil war. It worked.
It did. But over the next few centuries, the treaties that resolved internal disputes, like the Peace of Augsburg or later the Peace of Westphalia, always ended with the emperor granting even more sovereignty to the territorial princes.
Eventually, the princes had the right to make their own foreign alliances.
Exactly. The imperial title, held almost exclusively by the Habsburgs, became a vehicle for advancing Austrian dynastic interests rather than a mechanism for governing Germany.
The dishwasher was still plugged in, but it was no longer connected to the water supply.
That's a great way to put it. Now, the second shock was the detonation of the ideological canopy.
The entire system relied on the shared legal and moral framework of medieval Catholicism.
Right. And when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517, he doesn't just fracture the theology of Europe. He destroys the systemic glue of the Holy Roman Empire.
Because if the overarching canopy shatters into Catholic and Protestant factions, the fundamental alignment is gone.
The emperor can no longer act as the universal arbiter because half the princes view him as a heretic, and he views them as damned.
This systemic breakdown leads directly to the horror of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century.
Which began with the defenestration of Prague, a literal rejection of imperial authority where Bohemian nobles threw the emperor's representatives out of a window.
Just toss them right out.
Yeah. What followed was a complete structural failure that decimated the population and economy of Central Europe.
And the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the violence by institutionalizing the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion.
The local prince determined the religion of his territory. It formalized the absolute sovereignty of the local nodes, rendering the imperial center practically obsolete as a unifying force.
And while the empire is internally bleeding out, the third and final shock arrives from the outside, the rise of the nation-state.
The environment outside the empire had upgraded its operating system. States like France, England, and crucially, Prussia, which grew like a parasite from within the empire itself, were building massive professional standing armies.
Funded by highly efficient centralized bureaucracies that collected standardized national taxes.
Right.
The Holy Roman Empire was an architectural marvel of the 13th century. It was a sprawling, beautiful Gothic cathedral built on the delicate balance of 1,000 competing pressures. But the modern nation-state wasn't a cathedral, it was a cannon foundry.
That's beautifully said. The slow, cautious ad referendum negotiations of the imperial diet simply could not mobilize resources fast enough to compete with a state that could conscript its citizens and march 100,000 men across a border in weeks.
It's like they built incredible hardware for the year 1200, but by 1800, everyone else had upgraded to a totally different operating system, and the HRE was just too bogged down in legacy code to run it.
Exactly. And the final blow is delivered by the avatar of the centralized, bureaucratic, militarized state, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon utilizes the levée on mass universal conscription to field armies of unprecedented size and speed.
When he crushes the Austrian forces at Austerlitz, the systemic logic of the Holy Roman Empire simply evaporates. In 1806, recognizing that the framework is entirely obsolete, Emperor Francis II formally dissolves the empire.
But the critical distinction the notes make is that Napoleon doesn't just erase the Holy Roman Empire and replace it with a single, unified German state.
No, the territory shatters into the Confederation of the Rhine, the Austrian Empire, and eventually a newly unified Germany decades later.
What replaced the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a new map. It was a fundamentally new paradigm of power. The era of the decentralized, layered, religiously justified network was dead.
And the era of the centralized, bureaucratic, ethnically defined nation-state had begun.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question. If the Holy Roman Empire was made utterly obsolete by the modern nation-state, why does examining its systemic mechanics matter to a learner today?
Because the deep value lies in understanding that durability does not require dominance. The empire teaches us that you don't need absolute top-down control to maintain a functioning, resilient order.
Whether you are managing a complex corporate merger, coordinating a decentralized supply chain, or simply trying to navigate the overlapping jurisdictions of modern civic life, the Kenny mindset is profoundly applicable.
Charles IV recognized that trying to force unity upon a fractured reality only breeds violent resistance.
Sometimes the most stable architecture you can build is one that explicitly accepts the autonomy of its individual nodes, focusing entirely on maintaining the rules of engagement rather than dictating the daily operations.
You engineer the constraints, and you let the system run. It is the ultimate lesson in systemic humility.
The blueprint on the war table doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be capable of absorbing the stress without breaking the scaffolding. And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. For the past 2 centuries, the 19th century model of the nation-state, the clean map with solid, bold colors and centralized authority, has been the unquestioned default of global politics.
Right.
But look at the mechanics of the world we actually live in today. We exist in a hyper-globalized, digitally connected environment. We see massive, transnational tech corporations wielding capital and infrastructural control that dwarfs traditional countries.
We see decentralized cryptocurrencies actively bypassing the monopoly of state-run central banks.
We see overlapping extranational legal frameworks dictating trade and human rights. The solid colors on the map are beginning to bleed. The monopoly on power is fracturing.
It really is.
I would argue it goes even further than that.
Yep.
The nation-state is beginning to look incredibly slow and rigid when forced to interact with these new decentralized networks. Are we actually witnessing the slow erosion of the centralized state model?
It's a profound question.
Are we, right now, entering a new Holy Roman era of deeply overlapping, highly negotiated, decentralized authority? And if we are without the shared religious canopy that acted as the moral glue for the medieval world, what on earth is going to hold our fragmented system together?
That is the structural challenge of the next century.
Keep diving deep.